In a world where every royal gesture is watched, analyzed, and debated, there are moments that transcend protocol and reveal the raw humanity beneath the crown. What happens when a king, faced with the most devastating news of his life, instinctively reaches not for his wife, but for the woman who shares his deepest pain? This is the story of a single moment that made an entire room fall silent, a moment that would forever change how the world viewed the royal family. It's a story of grief, unexpected bonds, and the power of human connection that defies all expectations. When tragedy strikes the heart of the monarchy, watch as years of careful public relations crumble in the face of authentic emotion, revealing truths that no palace statement could ever capture. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Windsor Castle as members of the royal family gathered for what would become one of the most emotionally charged meetings in modern royal history. King Charles III sat at the head of the mahogany table in the oak room, his weathered hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white with tension. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Around the table sat the key figures of the royal household. Queen Camilla, elegant as always but with an unusual tension in her shoulders. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, her face pale but composed. Prince William, whose jaw was set in that familiar way that indicated he was struggling to contain powerful emotions. And several senior advisors whose faces reflected the gravity of the situation they were about to discuss. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Ancient portraits of long-dead monarchs looked down from the walls, their painted eyes witnessing yet another moment of crisis in the thousand-year history of the crown. The ornate chandelier above cast dancing shadows as a gentle breeze stirred the heavy curtains, but no one in the room was paying attention to such details. All eyes were focused on the papers spread before the king, documents that contained news so devastating it would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Dr. Patricia Henley, the royal physician, had arrived just 30 minutes earlier. Her usually confident demeanor was replaced by something Charles had rarely seen in his decades of working with medical professionals: uncertainty mixed with deep compassion. She had requested this emergency family meeting, and everyone present knew that such urgent gatherings were never called for good news. Charles had been preparing for this moment ever since his diagnosis 18 months earlier. The cancer had been detected early, the treatments had been aggressive, and, for a time, there had been hope. Real, tangible hope that had carried him through the grueling months of chemotherapy, radiation, and the countless medical appointments that had been carefully scheduled around his royal duties. The public had been told he was undergoing routine treatment, and, for a while, that hadn't been entirely untrue. But cancer, as Charles had learned, doesn't follow royal protocol. It doesn't respect crowns or centuries of tradition. It simply does what cancer does, and the latest test results had delivered a blow that even a lifetime of royal training couldn't prepare him for. The silence in the room was broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second marking time that suddenly felt infinitely precious. Camilla sat to Charles's right, her usual poise intact but her eyes betraying the fear she was trying so hard to hide. They had been through so much together: the scandals, the criticism, the slow journey from public pariahs to accepted members of the royal establishment. Now, just when they should have been enjoying the twilight of their years together, this devastating news threatened to tear apart everything they had built. Catherine sat across from Camilla, her hands folded in her lap in that perfectly composed way she had mastered over her years as a royal. But those who knew her well could see the slight tremor in her fingers, the way she kept glancing at William as if drawing strength from his presence. As the future queen consort, she understood that whatever was about to be discussed would fundamentally change not just Charles's life, but the entire trajectory of the monarchy. William occupied the chair to his father's left, his broad shoulders set in a way that suggested he was preparing to bear whatever burden was about to be placed upon them all. The relationship between father and son had not always been easy. There had been years of tension, of misunderstandings, of the inevitable conflicts that arise when one generation must prepare to hand power to the next. But, in recent years, especially since Charles's accession to the throne, they had found a new understanding, a deeper appreciation for the unique challenges they both faced. Dr. Henley cleared her throat gently, and every head in the room turned toward her. She was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had been treating Charles for his cancer, and her reputation for both medical excellence and Discretion had made her the obvious choice for the royal family's most sensitive health matters. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say, "the latest imaging results have come back, and I'm afraid I have some very difficult news to share with you all." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Camilla's hand moved almost unconsciously toward Charles, but stopped just short of touching him, as if she was afraid that physical contact might somehow make the coming words more real. "The cancer has metastasized more aggressively than we had hoped," Dr. Henley continued, her professional composure intact even as her voice carried the weight of delivering such devastating news. "The treatments we've been using have slowed the progression, but they haven't stopped it. The tumors have spread to the liver and lungs, and the bone scans show additional sites of concern." William's sharp intake of breath was audible in the silent room. Catherine's perfectly composed facade cracked just slightly, her lips pressing together in a thin line as she processed the implications of what they were hearing. Charles himself sat perfectly still, his face a mask of royal composure that he had been perfecting for over 7 decades. But those who knew him best could see the way his eyes had gone slightly unfocused, as if he was looking at something far beyond the walls of the room. "What are we talking about in terms of timeline?" William asked, his voice hoarse with emotion he was struggling to contain. Dr. Henley hesitated for just a moment, and, in that pause, everyone in the room understood that they were about to hear something that would change everything. "With aggressive treatment, we're looking at perhaps 6 to 12 months, she said quietly. "Without treatment, considerably less. I want to be clear that these are estimates, and every case is different. There are experimental treatments we could explore, clinical trials that might offer some hope, but I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't prepare you for the reality of the situation." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, which, Charles realized with startling clarity, was exactly what they were. 6 to 12 months. Less than a year to wrap up a lifetime of service, to prepare William for a role he wasn't quite ready for, to say goodbye to everything and everyone he loved. Camilla made a small sound, almost like a whimper, that she immediately tried to suppress. Her hand flew to her mouth, and, for the first time since Dr. Henley had begun speaking, Charles turned to look at her. What he saw there, the naked fear, the grief, the love, nearly broke his carefully maintained composure. But it was Catherine's reaction that surprised everyone in the room, including Charles himself. The young woman who had married into the royal family with such grace, who had handled every challenge with poise and dignity, suddenly stood up from her chair with such force that it scraped loudly against the wooden floor. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I need a moment." But instead of leaving the room as everyone expected, she remained standing, her hands gripping the back of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly, and Charles realized with surprise that the Princess of Wales was on the verge of a panic attack. "Catherine," William said softly, starting to rise from his own chair, but she held up a hand to stop him. "No, I'm fine," she said, though clearly she was anything but fine. "It's just this is—" She trailed off, unable to find words for what she was feeling. And, in that moment, Charles understood something that perhaps he should have realized long ago. Catherine wasn't just processing this news as his daughter-in-law, or as the future queen consort who would now have to step into her role much sooner than anyone had planned. She was processing it as someone who genuinely cared about him, who had come to love him not as a king or even as William's father, but as the man who had welcomed her into an extraordinary family and treated her with kindness and respect from the very beginning. The realization hit him with unexpected force. In all his years of royal duty, of carefully managed relationships and protocol-driven interactions, he had somehow found himself genuinely loved by this young woman who had every reason to see him as nothing more than an obligation. "Catherine," he said gently, and something in his voice made her look directly at him for the first time since Dr. Henley had delivered the devastating news. What passed between them in that moment was something that would later be difficult for anyone in the room to describe. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't inappropriate, but it was undeniably profound. It was the recognition of a bond that had developed over years of shared experiences, of family dinners and state occasions, of watching children grow up and navigating the unique challenges of royal life together. "Sit down, my dear," Charles said softly. "We'll figure this out together." Catherine sank back into her chair, but her composure was clearly hanging by a thread. The strong, capable woman who had handled everything from state dinners to public appearances with such grace was struggling to process the reality that the man she had come to see as a second father was dying. Dr. Henley continued with the clinical details, treatment options, timeline considerations, the various medical decisions that would need to be made in the coming weeks. But Charles found himself only half listening to the medical terminology. Instead, he was acutely aware of the people around the table, these individuals who would be left to carry on without him. Camilla sat rigidly upright, her training as a member of the royal family keeping her composed even as Charles could see the devastation in her eyes. They had waited so long to be together openly, had endured decades of criticism and scandal, and now their time was being cut short just when they should have been able to enjoy the fruits of their patience. William was asking practical questions about treatment schedules and how to manage the king's official duties during the coming months. Ever the future king, he was already thinking about succession, about the constitutional implications, about how to maintain stability during what would inevitably be a period of tremendous uncertainty. But it was Catherine who continued to capture Charles's attention. She had regained her composure somewhat, but he could see that she was fighting tears. Every few moments, her eyes would dart to his face as if she was trying to memorize it, as if she was already beginning the process of saying goodbye. When Dr. Henley finished her presentation and gathered her papers, she looked around the table one final time. "I want you all to know," she said, "that we will do everything possible to ensure His Majesty's comfort and to maximize whatever time we have. This is not a situation where we give up hope, but it is a situation where we need to be realistic about what we're facing." After she left, the room fell into a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, Charles spoke. "Well," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I suppose we have some planning to do." But even as he began to discuss the practical implications of his diagnosis, the need to accelerate William's preparation for kingship, the careful management of public announcements, the delicate balance between maintaining hope and preparing for reality, Charles found his thoughts returning again and again to Catherine's reaction. In all his years of royal duty, he had grown accustomed to people caring about him for what he represented rather than who he was. But in Catherine's tears, in her genuine distress at the news of his illness, he had seen something different. He had seen authentic love, the kind that transcends duty and protocol. As the meeting continued, as they discussed timelines and treatment plans and the 1,000 details that would need to be managed in the coming months, Charles made a mental note to spend more time with Catherine in whatever days remained to him. He wanted to tell her how much her presence in their family had meant to him, how watching her grow into her role had been one of the unexpected joys of his later years. He wanted her to know that her genuine affection had been a gift he hadn't expected but had treasured more than she could possibly know. But, for now, there was work to be done, plans to be made, and the careful business of preparing a monarchy for transition. The personal conversations, the expressions of love and gratitude, would have to wait. What none of them knew, as they sat in that oak-paneled room planning for a future that suddenly felt terrifyingly uncertain, was that the most revealing moment was still to come. The moment that would strip away all pretense and protocol and reveal the true depths of the bonds that had formed within this extraordinary family. That moment was still weeks away, but when it came, it would change everything. 3 weeks had passed since that devastating morning meeting, and the royal household had settled into a new rhythm dictated by the reality of Charles's condition. The public remained unaware of the full extent of the king's illness, with palace statements continuing to speak of ongoing treatment and continued recovery. But within the walls of the various royal residences, everyone was acutely aware that they were living on borrowed time. Charles had insisted on maintaining as many of his official duties as possible, a decision that both inspired and worried those closest to him. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, had become a master of strategic scheduling, clustering appointments on days when the king felt strongest and building in recovery time that could be disguised as private study or constitutional duties. On this particular Tuesday morning, Charles sat in his study at Highgrove, surrounded by red boxes containing the day's government papers, but his attention kept drifting to the window overlooking the gardens he had spent decades creating and nurturing. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had always been a long-term thinker, planning gardens that would mature over decades, supporting environmental causes that would benefit generations yet unborn, and now he was measuring his own future in months rather than years. A soft knock at the door interrupted his melancholy thoughts. Without waiting for permission to enter, a privilege reserved for only the most senior family members, Catherine appeared in the doorway. She had clearly been out riding, her hair slightly disheveled despite her attempt to smooth it back, and there was a healthy flush in her cheeks that spoke of fresh air and exercise. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she said, though her smile suggested she knew perfectly well that she was welcome regardless of what he might be doing. "Nothing that can't wait," Charles replied, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "How was your ride?" "Therapeutic," Catherine said, settling into the chair with the easy grace that had become second nature to her over the years. "I needed to clear my head before the children's activities this afternoon." Charles nodded, understanding without need for explanation. The past few weeks had been difficult for everyone in the family, but perhaps none more so than Catherine, who found herself caught between supporting William through his own grief and preparing for a role she had always known would be hers but had hoped wouldn't come quite so soon. "How are George, Charlotte, and Louis handling everything?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They know something's wrong," Catherine said carefully. "Children always do, don't they? We've told them that Grandpa is sick and receiving excellent medical care, which is true as far as it goes. But George especially has been asking more pointed questions lately." Charles felt a familiar pang of regret. His eldest grandson was now 11, old enough to begin understanding the weight of his future responsibilities, but still young enough to need the security of believing that the adults in his life were invincible. The thought of leaving these children, of not being there to watch them grow up, and help guide them through the unique challenges of their royal heritage, was perhaps the hardest part of accepting his diagnosis. "What kind of questions?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Catherine hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Yesterday he asked me if being king meant you couldn't get better from being sick. I think he's been reading between the lines of the news coverage, putting together pieces that we thought we'd kept separate." Charles was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. George was a bright child, sensitive and observant in ways that sometimes surprised the adults around him. It made sense that he would be the first to sense the gravity of the situation, even if he couldn't yet fully articulate what he was feeling. "What did you tell him?" Charles asked. "The truth, as much as I could," Catherine replied. "That being king doesn't protect you from getting sick, but it does mean you have access to the best doctors in the world, that you're fighting very hard to get better, and that regardless of what happens, we're all going to take care of each other." Charles felt a surge of gratitude toward this remarkable young woman who had become such an integral part of their family. She had handled George's questions with exactly the right balance of honesty and reassurance, giving him information without overwhelming him with adult fears and concerns. "I'd like to spend some individual time with each of them in the coming weeks," Charles said. "Not formal events or official occasions, just grandfather time. Will you help me arrange that?" "Of course," Catherine said immediately. "They would love that. George especially has been asking when he can visit you alone, without his siblings tagging along." They spent the next few minutes discussing scheduling, comparing calendars, and finding windows of time that could accommodate both Charles's medical appointments and the children's school schedules. It was the kind of mundane conversation that families have all the time, but Charles found himself treasuring every moment of it, acutely aware that such simple planning sessions were numbered. As they talked, Charles found himself studying Catherine's face, noting the subtle changes that the past few weeks had brought. There were new lines around her eyes, evidence of the strain she was under, but there was also something else, a quality he had seen in his mother during difficult times, a steely determination to carry on regardless of personal cost. "How are you holding up?" he asked when they had finished with the scheduling details. Catherine's composure flickered for just a moment before she regained control. "I'm fine," she said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Catherine," Charles said gently, "you don't have to be fine all the time. Not with me." The kindness in his voice seemed to unlock something in her, and for the first time since that devastating meeting 3 weeks earlier, Catherine allowed her careful mask to slip. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that's selfish, with what you're going through, but I'm terrified of losing you and terrified of what comes next." Charles leaned forward in his chair, his heart aching for this young woman who was carrying such a heavy burden. "It's not selfish at all," he said. "It's human. And it's exactly how I would expect someone who cares about our family to feel. I keep thinking about all the things I wanted to ask you," Catherine continued, the words tumbling out now that she had started. "About being royal, about raising the children, about handling the pressure and the criticism. I thought we had years and years for those conversations. We still have time, Charles said, though even as he spoke the words, he was aware of their conditional nature. What would you like to know? Catherine shook her head. It's not about the practical things, really. I can figure those out, or learn as I go. It's more about. She paused, searching for the right words. You've been so kind to me from the very beginning, even when the press was being horrible, even when I made mistakes. You made me feel like I belonged in this family before I ever believed it myself. Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had always tried to be welcoming to Catherine, remembering his own difficult introduction to royal life, and wanting to spare her some of the isolation and confusion he had experienced. But he hadn't realized how much his acceptance had meant to her. You did belong, he said simply. From the moment William brought you to meet us, it was clear that you were going to be something special, not just as his wife, but as a person who would strengthen our family and our institution. I don't feel very strong right now, Catherine admitted. Strength isn't about not feeling scared or overwhelmed, Charles said. It's about continuing to do what needs to be done despite those feelings. And you're doing that beautifully. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the gardens outside the window where gardeners were preparing the beds for winter. Charles had always found peace in observing the cycles of nature, the way life persisted and renewed itself even in the face of death and dormancy. I have something I want to give you, Charles said suddenly, rising from his chair and moving to a cabinet on the far wall. From a locked drawer, he withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. This belonged to my mother, he explained, returning to his seat and placing the journal on the desk between them. She gave it to me just before she died, along with some advice about kingship and family that I've treasured ever since. Catherine looked at the journal with something approaching awe. Queen Elizabeth II's personal writings were among the most private documents in royal history, and the fact that Charles was sharing them with her spoke to the depth of trust and affection he had developed for his daughter-in-law. I couldn't possibly, Catherine began, but Charles held up a hand to stop her. She wrote about the challenges of balancing royal duty with personal happiness, about raising children in the public eye, about the loneliness that sometimes comes with the crown. I think her words would be helpful to you, both now and in the years to come. Catherine accepted the journal with trembling hands, understanding the magnitude of the gift she was receiving. Thank you, she whispered. I'll treasure it. There's something else, Charles said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. I've been thinking about the transition, about what happens when William becomes king. I want you to know that I have complete confidence in both of you. But I also want you to know that the institution will adapt to your strengths and interests, just as it did for Diana and for Camilla. The mention of Diana's name hung in the air between them for a moment. Catherine had always been compared to William's mother, sometimes favorably and sometimes not, and she had learned to navigate those comparisons with grace and dignity. I hope I can honor her memory while also being myself, Catherine said carefully. You already do, Charles replied. Diana would have adored you, and she would have been so proud to see the woman William chose to spend his life with. But you don't need to be her, Catherine. You need to be yourself, and that will be more than enough. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door, followed by the appearance of Camilla, who looked slightly hesitant about interrupting their private discussion. I'm sorry to intrude, she said, but Sir Clive is looking for you, Charles. Something about the afternoon appointments. Charles glanced at his watch and realized that their conversation had stretched much longer than he had intended. Tell him I'll be right there, he said to Camilla, then turned back to Catherine. We should continue this conversation soon. There's so much more I want to share with you. As Catherine rose to leave, clutching the precious journal to her chest, she impulsively leaned forward and kissed Charles on the cheek, a gesture that was both informal and deeply affectionate. Thank you, she said simply, for everything, for welcoming me, for trusting me, for treating me like a daughter instead of just a duty. After she left, Charles sat alone in his study, touched by the depth of feeling Catherine had expressed. In all his years of royal service, through all the ceremonies and state occasions and formal relationships, he had rarely experienced such genuine, uncomplicated affection. Camilla returned a few minutes later, having dealt with Sir Clive's concerns, and found Charles still sitting quietly, lost in thought. Everything all right? She asked, settling into the chair Catherine had vacated. Better than all right, Charles said. I was just thinking about how lucky we've been, to have Catherine join our family. She's going to make a wonderful queen." Camilla smiled, understanding without explanation the significance of what had just transpired. She had watched Charles struggle with the reality of his diagnosis, with the knowledge that he would have less time than he had hoped to guide William and Catherine through their preparation for kingship. But moments like this one, moments of genuine connection and mutual affection, seemed to give him peace about what he would be leaving behind. "She loves you very much," Camilla said simply. "You can see it in the way she looks at you, and how she talks about you when you're not around. It's not duty or obligation. It's real affection." Charles nodded, thinking about Catherine's tears that first day, about her obvious distress at the news of his illness. In a world where so many relationships were transactional, where people valued him for his title rather than his character, Catherine's authentic care had been an unexpected gift. As the afternoon wore on, as Charles dealt with the endless parade of appointments and briefings that made up his daily routine, he found himself thinking about the conversation with Catherine and about the journal he had given her. His mother's words had sustained him through some of his darkest moments as king, and he hoped they would do the same for Catherine in the challenging years ahead. But, more than that, he realized that in sharing those private thoughts with Catherine, he had taken another step toward acceptance of his own mortality. The transition was coming whether he was ready for it or not, and his job now was to ensure that the people he loved were as prepared as possible for what lay ahead. That evening, as he and Camilla shared a quiet dinner in their private dining room, Charles found himself at peace in a way he hadn't been since receiving his diagnosis. The work of preparing his successors was well underway, but, more importantly, the relationships that would sustain the family through the difficult transition were strong and growing stronger. He thought about George's perceptive questions, about Catherine's vulnerability and strength, about William's determination to honor his father's legacy while also making the monarchy his own. These were the things that would matter in the months and years to come, not the constitutional details or the ceremonial protocols, but the bonds of love and mutual support that would carry the family forward. As Charles prepared for bed that night, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel again after receiving his diagnosis: hope. Not hope for a medical miracle, but hope for the future of the institution he had devoted his life to serving. In Catherine's tears, in her genuine affection, in her determination to honor both Diana's memory and her own authentic self, Charles saw the promise of a monarchy that would continue to evolve and adapt while maintaining its essential character. The most challenging moments were still to come, but, for tonight, Charles allowed himself to feel grateful for the unexpected blessings that had emerged from this difficult time: the deepening of relationships, the stripping away of pretense, and the recognition of love in its many forms. The first public sign that something was seriously wrong came during what should have been a routine state reception at Buckingham Palace. Charles had insisted on hosting the evening event for the visiting Prime Minister of Canada, despite the concerns of both his medical team and his private secretary. He had been having more good days than bad lately, and the diplomatic importance of the occasion seemed to outweigh the physical demands it would place on him. Catherine had arrived early that evening, as had become her custom for major state occasions. She liked to check the arrangements personally, to ensure that every detail was perfect and that any potential issues could be addressed before the guests arrived. But, as she made her final rounds through the state dining room, she noticed something that made her pause. Charles was standing near one of the tall windows, ostensibly reviewing the evening's program, but Catherine could see that his hands were trembling slightly as he held the papers. His face, which had been carefully made up by the palace staff to minimize the effects of his ongoing treatment, appeared gray beneath the professional cosmetics. "Your Majesty," she said softly, approaching him with the kind of careful concern she might show one of her children when they were feeling unwell. Charles looked up, and Catherine was struck by how much effort it seemed to take him to focus on her face. His eyes, which had always been sharp and attentive, appeared slightly unfocused, as if he was looking at her through a fog. "Catherine," he said, and she could hear the strain in his voice despite his attempt to sound normal. "Everything looks beautiful. Your attention to detail never ceases to amaze me. Are you feeling all right?" she asked, stepping closer and lowering her voice so that the various staff members moving around the room wouldn't overhear. "Just tired," Charles replied, though they both knew it was more than simple fatigue. Nothing that a good night's sleep won't cure. Catherine wasn't convinced, but she also knew that Charles was not going to admit to feeling unwell just hours before an important state function. Instead, She made a mental note to keep a close eye on him throughout the evening and to position herself where she could offer support if needed. The reception began smoothly enough. Charles, drawing on decades of experience and royal training, managed to project an image of health and vitality as he greeted the Canadian delegation and mingled with the assembled guests. His conversation was as engaging as ever, his knowledge of Canadian politics and culture impressive as always, and his natural charm evident in the way visitors responded to his presence. But Catherine, watching from across the room as she fulfilled her own duties as hostess, could see the signs that others missed. She noticed the way Charles would occasionally pause mid-sentence, as if gathering his strength. She saw how he had begun leaning more heavily than usual on furniture or against walls, making it appear casual when it was actually necessary for his stability. Most concerning of all, she observed the way Camilla had positioned herself throughout the evening. The queen consort was never far from her husband's side, ready to step in if needed, but doing so with such subtlety that most guests probably assumed it was simply her natural inclination to stay close to him. About halfway through the reception, as the formal dinner was about to be announced, Catherine noticed Charles excuse himself from a conversation with the Canadian finance minister. She watched as he made his way toward a small anteroom off the main reception area, moving more slowly than usual and with a deliberate carefulness that suggested he was concentrating hard on each step. Without thinking about protocol or her own duties as hostess, Catherine followed him. She found Charles in the anteroom, sitting heavily in one of the ornate chairs, his head in his hands. The careful composure he had maintained all evening had finally cracked, and Catherine could see that he was struggling just to remain upright. "Your Majesty," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Charles looked up, and Catherine was shocked by what she saw. The careful makeup couldn't hide the pallor of his skin or the exhaustion in his eyes. More alarming still, there was a sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the palace. "I'm fine," he said automatically, though his voice lacked any conviction. "No, you're not," Catherine replied gently, moving to kneel beside his chair. "You're clearly unwell. We should call Dr. Henley." "Absolutely not," Charles said, some of his usual authority returning to his voice. "We have a state dinner to host. There are diplomatic relationships at stake, constitutional obligations to fulfill." Catherine felt a familiar frustration at the way Charles consistently placed duty above his own well-being. It was an admirable quality in many ways, but it was also potentially dangerous given his current condition. "The dinner can proceed without you," she said firmly. "William and I can handle the hosting duties. The guests will understand." "Will they?" Charles asked, and Catherine heard something in his voice that surprised her: fear. Not fear of his illness, but fear of the public speculation that would inevitably follow if he suddenly disappeared from his own state dinner. She realized then that Charles wasn't just pushing through this evening because of some abstract sense of duty. He was terrified that any public display of weakness would lead to speculation about his health, speculation that could destabilize the monarchy at a time when stability was crucial. "What if we compromise?" Catherine suggested. "You make the welcome speech, participate in the first course, and then excuse yourself, citing a minor diplomatic emergency that requires your immediate attention. William and I will handle the rest of the evening." Charles considered this suggestion, clearly weighing his physical limitations against his royal obligations. After a long moment, he nodded. "That might work," he said. "But I'll need a few minutes to compose myself." "Of course," Catherine said. "I'll make sure you're not disturbed." She was about to leave him alone to rest when she heard him say her name softly. "Catherine." She turned back to find him looking at her with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with something that looked almost like wonder. "Thank you," he said simply, "for thinking of a solution instead of just telling me what I should do. For understanding why this matters to me." Catherine felt her throat tighten with emotion. In that moment, she saw not the King of England, but a sick man trying desperately to fulfill his obligations while grappling with his own mortality. "We're family," she said, the words coming out more emotionally than she had intended. "We take care of each other." The plan worked better than Catherine had dared to hope. Charles managed to deliver his welcome speech with his usual eloquence, chatted comfortably with the Canadian Prime Minister during the first course, and then excused himself with such diplomatic skill that most of the guests probably assumed he was dealing with some urgent government matter. Catherine and William smoothly took over hosting duties, with Camilla providing quiet support and ensuring that the conversation continued to flow naturally. The evening concluded successfully, with the Canadian delegation expressing their appreciation for the warm welcome they had received. But the real test came afterward, when the family gathered in Charles's private study for what had become their customary post-event debrief. Charles was visibly exhausted, slumped in his chair in a way that was utterly unlike his usual upright posture. The energy required to maintain his public facade for even those few hours had clearly taken a significant toll. "That was well managed," William said, though his eyes were on his father with obvious concern. The Canadians were pleased with the evening, and I don't think anyone suspected anything unusual. "Catherine deserves the credit for that," Charles said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. Her quick thinking saved the evening. Camilla, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "This can't continue," she said, her voice tight with worry and frustration. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this. What if you had collapsed in front of the Canadian delegation? What if the next episode is more serious?" The bluntness of her words hung in the air. Everyone in the room knew she was right, but no one wanted to face the implications of what she was saying. "The people need to see their king," Charles said, but his protest lacked conviction. "The people need their king to be alive," Camilla shot back, her usual diplomatic restraint abandoned in the face of her fear for her husband. Catherine found herself in the uncomfortable position of mediator between a married couple having what was essentially a private argument about life and death decisions. "Perhaps we could be more selective about which events require your personal attendance," she suggested carefully. "Focus on the most important occasions, and find appropriate ways to delegate or postpone the others." William nodded in agreement. "We could gradually increase the number of events that Catherine and I handle alone, letting people get accustomed to seeing us in more prominent roles." Charles looked around the room at the three people who loved him most in the world, all of them united in their concern for his well-being. The weight of their collective worry seemed to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. "I know you're all trying to protect me," he said slowly, "but you have to understand that every event I miss, every duty I delegate, is another step toward the end. And I'm not ready for that yet." The raw honesty of his admission left everyone speechless for a moment. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized that Charles's stubborn insistence on maintaining his full schedule wasn't just about duty. It was about denial, about refusing to accept that his time was running out. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "no one is asking you to give up. We're just asking you to be strategic about where you spend your energy." "What Catherine is suggesting makes sense," Camilla added, her voice gentle now that she understood the deeper fears behind Charles's resistance. "Save your strength for the events that truly matter, for the moments when only you can fulfill the role that needs to be filled." Charles was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the palace gardens that were barely visible in the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft that everyone had to lean forward to hear him. "I suppose I've been thinking that if I could just maintain the illusion of normalcy long enough, somehow it would become real again," he said. "That if I performed the role of healthy king convincingly enough, my body would forget that it's failing." Catherine felt her heart break a little at the vulnerability in his voice. This was a man who had spent his entire life being strong for others, and now he was being forced to confront his own mortality while still trying to fulfill the enormous responsibilities of kingship. "There's nothing abnormal about being sick," she said gently. "Even kings get sick. What would be abnormal would be pretending otherwise until it's too late to make the choices that matter." William reached over and placed a hand on his father's arm. "We'll figure this out together," he said. "All of us. That's what families do." As the evening wound down, and they began to discuss practical arrangements for the coming weeks, Catherine found herself watching Charles with new eyes. She had always respected him as a king and grown to love him as a father figure, but tonight she had seen him as something else entirely, a man facing the ultimate challenge with as much grace and dignity as he could muster. The facade of invincibility that surrounded the monarchy had cracked that evening, at least within the walls of that private study. But rather than making Charles seem weaker, his vulnerability had somehow made him more human, more relatable, and ultimately more worthy of the love and protection that surrounded him. As Catherine made her way home that night, she realized that the evening had marked a turning point. They could no longer pretend that everything was normal, that Charles's illness was just a temporary setback that would eventually be overcome. They were now officially in the business of managing a transition, of preparing for a future that none of them felt ready to face. But they were also deeper into something else, a level of trust and mutual care that transcended the formal relationships of royal duty. They had become, in the truest sense, a family united not just by blood and marriage, but by love and shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. The most challenging test of that commitment was still to come, but tonight had proven that when the stakes were highest, they could count on each other in ways that went far beyond the requirements of protocol or tradition. The call came at 3:47 in the morning, piercing through the peaceful silence of apartment 1A at Kensington Palace like a knife. Catherine jerked awake instantly, that particular maternal instinct that makes mothers hyper-alert to nighttime disturbances kicking into overdrive. Beside her, William was already reaching for his phone, his movement efficient and controlled despite having been pulled from deep sleep. "It's Camilla," he said, his voice hoarse but immediately alert as he answered the call. Catherine sat up, pulling her robe around her shoulders as she listened to William's side of the conversation. Even without hearing Camilla's words, she could tell from William's increasingly tense responses that something was seriously wrong. "How long has he been unconscious?" William asked, and Catherine felt her stomach drop. "Yes, we're coming now. Have you called Dr. Henley?" By the time William ended the call, Catherine was already out of bed, moving toward her closet with the kind of focused urgency that came from years of responding to family emergencies. "Charles collapsed in his study about 20 minutes ago," William explained as he threw on clothes. "Camilla found him on the floor. He's breathing, his pulse is steady, but he won't wake up." They made the drive to Windsor Castle in record time, Catherine's hands clenched tightly in her lap, as William navigated the empty roads with the kind of controlled speed that spoke to his military training. Neither of them spoke much during the journey. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't sound either like false optimism or devastating pessimism. When they arrived at the castle, they found it transformed into something resembling a medical facility. Ambulance lights cast red and blue shadows across the ancient stone walls, and Catherine could see medical personnel moving efficiently between vehicles and the main entrance. The sight was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it meant Charles was receiving immediate professional care, terrifying because it made the severity of the situation impossible to ignore. They were met at the entrance by Sir Clive Alderton, who looked as if he had aged several years in the past hour. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, and his hair uncombed, evidence of having been awakened and summoned with the same urgency as William and Catherine. "How is he?" William asked without preamble. "Stable, but still unconscious," Sir Clive replied, his voice carefully professional despite the obvious strain he was under. "Dr. Henley is with him now, along with a team from the Royal London Hospital. They're preparing to transport him there for more comprehensive testing." Catherine felt her legs go weak at the implications of what she was hearing. Charles had always been so adamant about receiving medical care at home whenever possible, partly for privacy reasons, but also because hospitals made everything feel more serious, more final. The fact that medical professionals were insisting on hospital transport suggested that his condition had deteriorated beyond what could be managed in the familiar surroundings of the royal residences. "Where's Camilla?" Catherine asked, surprised to realize that the Queen Consort was nowhere to be seen. "With His Majesty," Sir Clive replied. She's not handling this well." William and Catherine exchanged a look of concern. Camilla had been the picture of strength and dignity throughout Charles's illness, maintaining her composure even during the most difficult moments. If she was struggling now, the situation must be truly grave. They made their way through corridors that Catherine had walked hundreds of times before, but everything felt different now, more urgent, more fragile, as if the ancient stones themselves understood that they were witnessing a potentially historic moment. The familiar portraits of long-dead monarchs seemed to watch their progress with particular intensity, as if sensing that the current occupant of the throne might soon be joining their ranks in history rather than life. When they reached Charles's private quarters, they could hear voices from behind the closed door, medical professionals discussing treatment options in the kind of urgent, technical language that always sounds ominous to family members. William knocked gently before entering, and Catherine followed close behind. The scene that greeted them was unlike anything Catherine had ever witnessed in her years as a member of the royal family. Charles lay unconscious on his bed, surrounded by medical equipment that had been quickly assembled by the emergency team. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking vital signs that Catherine couldn't interpret, but that clearly concerned the medical professionals hovering nearby. But it was Camilla who captured Catherine's immediate attention. The Queen Consort sat in a chair beside the bed, holding Charles's hand and speaking to him in a low, continuous murmur. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her face streaked with tears that she wasn't bothering to wipe away, and her shoulders shook with the kind of grief that comes from watching someone you love slip away despite all efforts to hold on to them. "Camilla," William said softly, approaching his stepmother with the kind of gentle caution one might use with a wounded animal. She looked up at them with eyes that were red and swollen from crying, and Catherine was shocked by the transformation. This was not the composed, dignified woman who had stood beside Charles through countless public events. This was a wife watching her husband die, and all the royal training in the world couldn't prepare someone for that kind of raw human experience. "He won't wake up," Camilla said, her voice broken and small. "I keep talking to him, telling him about the garden, about the events coming up next week, about anything I can think of, but he won't wake up." Catherine moved to Camilla's other side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She had never felt particularly close to her mother-in-law. Their personalities were quite different, and there had always been the complicated history with Diana casting a shadow over their relationship. But, in this moment, none of that mattered. All Catherine could see was a woman in pain, and every instinct she possessed told her to provide comfort. "The doctors are taking excellent care of him," Catherine said, though the words felt inadequate even as she spoke them. Dr. Henley approached them, her face grave but professional. "Your Majesties," she said, addressing William and Catherine with the titles they would soon inherit whether they felt ready or not. "I need to discuss His Majesty's condition with you." They moved to a small sitting area adjacent to the bedroom, though Catherine noticed that Camilla refused to leave Charles's side. William settled into a chair across from Dr. Henley, while Catherine remained standing, too anxious to sit still. "The collapse appears to have been caused by a combination of factors," Dr. Henley began. "His blood pressure dropped significantly, likely due to the progression of his cancer and the cumulative effects of his treatments. We've managed to stabilize him, but he remains unconscious, and we're not sure when, or if, he'll wake up." The brutal honesty of her assessment hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had known that Charles was seriously ill, had accepted that his time was limited, but somehow she had always assumed there would be more warning, more time to prepare for the final stages of his illness. "What are his chances?" William asked, his voice steady despite what Catherine could see was tremendous emotional strain. "Honestly, I don't know," Dr. Henley replied. "He could regain consciousness in a few hours and have several more weeks or even months of relatively good health. Or this could be the beginning of the end. I'm sorry I can't give you more definitive answers, but with cases like this, we simply have to wait and see." The uncertainty was almost worse than a definitive prognosis would have been. Catherine found herself thinking about all the conversations she had planned to have with Charles, all the advice she had wanted to seek, all the moments of connection they had shared, and the ones they might never have. "We need to make some decisions about public communications," Sir Clive said gently. "The transport to the hospital can't be kept completely private, and if His Majesty's condition doesn't improve quickly, we'll need to consider how much information to share with the public." William ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Catherine recognized as his way of processing overwhelming stress. "Let's get him to the hospital first," he said. "Then, we can figure out what comes next." The process of preparing Charles for transport was both efficient and heartbreaking. The medical team worked with practiced precision, transferring him to a gurney and connecting him to portable versions of the monitoring equipment. Throughout it all, Camilla held his hand, speaking to him in the same continuous, gentle murmur, as if her voice alone could anchor him to consciousness. Catherine found herself thinking about the children, who were still asleep at Kensington Palace, unaware that their grandfather's condition had taken such a dramatic turn for the worse. George, with his perceptive questions and growing understanding of his future role, would need careful explanation. Charlotte and Louis, still young enough to believe that adults could fix anything, would need reassurance that might be impossible to provide honestly. As they prepared to leave for the hospital, Catherine made a spontaneous decision that surprised even her. Instead of riding with William in their own car, she climbed into the ambulance beside Camilla, settling into the small space available for family members during transport. Camilla looked at her with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "You don't have to," she began, but Catherine cut her off. "Yes, I do," Catherine said firmly. "We're all in this together." The ride to the hospital passed in relative silence, broken only by the steady beeping of Charles's monitors and Camilla's continued quiet conversation with her unconscious husband. Catherine found herself studying Charles's face, trying to memorize the details of his features in case this was among the last chances she would have to see him alive. Despite the medical emergency that had brought them together, despite the uncertainty and fear that filled the ambulance, Catherine felt something unexpected, a sense of rightness about being there, about supporting Camilla through this terrifying ordeal. They might not have chosen each other under different circumstances, but they were family now, bound together by love for the same man and shared responsibility for the institution he represented. As the ambulance pulled into the hospital's emergency entrance, Catherine realized that regardless of what happened in the coming hours or days, this night had changed everything. The careful distance that had always existed between her and Camilla had evaporated in the face of shared crisis. They were no longer just two women who happened to be married to men in the same family. They had become allies in the most fundamental sense, united by their determination to protect and support Charles through whatever was coming next. The sight of the hospital's emergency department, with its harsh fluorescent lighting and institutional efficiency, drove home the reality of their situation in a way that the genteel surroundings of Windsor Castle had not. This was no longer about managing Charles's illness privately within the comfort of royal residences. They were now fully in the realm of medical emergency, where royal titles mattered less than vital signs, and where the outcome was entirely out of their control. As Charles was wheeled into the hospital, surrounded by medical professionals and monitoring equipment, Catherine found herself walking beside Camilla, offering what support she could to a woman who had suddenly become more than a mother-in-law. She had become a fellow traveler on a journey that none of them had chosen, but all of them would have to complete together. The most crucial test of their family bonds was still ahead, waiting for them in whatever this night would bring. But Catherine felt ready to face it, knowing that love, not duty, not protocol, not tradition, but genuine human love, would guide them through whatever came next. The hospital waiting room had been cleared of other patients and family members, transformed into a temporary royal sanctuary where the most powerful people in Britain sat in plastic chairs under fluorescent lights, waiting for news that would reshape the monarchy. It was 6:30 in the morning, and Charles had been unconscious for nearly 4 hours. Catherine sat curled in an uncomfortable chair, still wearing the clothes she had hastily thrown on when Camilla's call came. Beside her, William paced restlessly, his royal training warring with his very human need to do something, anything, to help his father. Sir Clive huddled with other senior palace staff in one corner, speaking in hushed tones about constitutional implications and succession protocols that nobody wanted to think about, but couldn't ignore. Camilla had refused to leave the intensive care unit, maintaining her vigil beside Charles's bed despite the gentle suggestions from medical staff that she rest. Every hour, she would emerge with updates that became progressively more concerning. His blood pressure was dropping, his breathing had become more labored, and, most distressing of all, there had been no signs of consciousness despite the medical team's best efforts. Dr. Henley appeared in the doorway of the waiting room, her expression grave. The assembled group fell silent immediately, every person present understanding that whatever she was about to say would be momentous. "I need to speak with the family privately," she said, her voice carefully controlled. William, Catherine, and the senior staff members followed her into a small conference room adjacent to the waiting area. The institutional green walls and generic motivational posters seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. This was where the most important conversation in recent royal history was about to take place, and it looked like any other hospital meeting room in Britain. "His condition has deteriorated significantly over the past hour," Dr. Henley began without preamble. "His blood pressure is dropping despite our interventions, and his kidney function is failing. Most concerning, his brain activity has decreased substantially." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. Even with her limited medical knowledge, she understood the implications of what they were hearing. "What exactly are you telling us?" William asked, his voice hoarse. Dr. Henley took a deep breath before delivering the words that would change everything. "I'm telling you that His Majesty is dying. It could be hours, it could be days, but his body is shutting down." "I'm sorry." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine found herself thinking of George's innocent questions about whether being king protected you from getting sick, of Charlotte's gap-toothed smile when her grandfather read her bedtime stories, of Louis's delighted laughter when Charles would chase him through the gardens at Highgrove. "Does he know?" William asked quietly. "Is he in pain?" "We don't believe he's experiencing any discomfort," Dr. Henley replied. "And, while we can't be certain about his level of awareness, Many patients in similar conditions do retain some ability to hear and process what's happening around them. Catherine thought immediately of Camilla, sitting beside Charles's bed and speaking to him in that continuous, gentle murmur. The idea that he might be able to hear her, that her presence might be providing some comfort in his final hours, was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "We need to call the children home from school," William said, his practical mind already shifting to the necessary arrangements. "And we need to contact the Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Commonwealth Governors General." "William," Catherine said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "Before we start making calls and managing protocols, maybe we should just be with him. Say goodbye while we still can." The simple wisdom of her suggestion cut through the royal training that was already pushing William toward duty and procedure. His face crumpled slightly, and Catherine saw the scared son beneath the future king. "You're right," he said. "Everything else can wait." They returned to the ICU together, where they found Camilla exactly as they had left her, holding Charles's hand and speaking softly about ordinary things. She looked up when they entered, and Catherine could see in her eyes that she already knew what Dr. Henley had told them. "How long do we have?" Camilla asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Dr. Henley thinks hours rather than days," William replied gently. Camilla nodded, as if this news was something she had been preparing herself to hear. "I've been telling him about the roses at Highgrove," she said. "How beautiful they look right now. How proud he should be of the garden he created. I thought he should hear about beautiful things." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the tenderness in Camilla's voice. Whatever complicated feelings she had ever harbored about her mother-in-law evaporated completely in the face of such pure, devoted love. They arranged themselves around Charles's bed, each taking turns to speak to him privately while the others stepped back to give them space. When Catherine's turn came, she found herself struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "I don't know if you can hear me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've given me. Not just the welcome into your family, but the example of what it means to serve something bigger than yourself." She paused, watching his peaceful face and trying to reconcile this vulnerable, unconscious man with the powerful figure who had guided the monarchy through so many challenges. "I promise you that, William, and I will take care of everything," she continued. "The children, the family, the crown, will honor everything you've built and will make you proud. And I want you to know that I love you, not as a king or a father-in-law, but as the kind, generous man who made me feel like I belonged from the very first day." As she stepped back to allow William his private moment with his father, Catherine felt a hand slip into hers. She looked down to find that Camilla had reached for her, seeking and offering comfort in the simple gesture of human connection. They stood together like that, watching William whisper urgently to his father, probably sharing memories and making promises and expressing all the complicated emotions that exist between fathers and sons. The monitors continued their steady beeping, measuring out Charles's remaining time in electronic intervals that seemed both too fast and too slow. It was nearly noon when the first significant change occurred. Charles's breathing, which had been labored but steady, suddenly became irregular. Dr. Henley, who had been monitoring him closely, moved quickly to check his vital signs. "His blood pressure is dropping rapidly," she said quietly. "This may be the beginning of the final stage." The word sent a shock through everyone present. Despite hours of preparation, despite knowing that this moment was inevitable, the reality of Charles actually dying still seemed impossible to accept. More family members had arrived during the morning. Princess and, looking grim and determined, Prince Edward and Sophie, both struggling visibly with emotion, and even Prince Andrew, putting aside years of family tensions to be present for this moment. The small ICU room was crowded with people who had spent decades defining their lives in relation to the man lying unconscious in the hospital bed. But, as Charles's condition continued to deteriorate, as his breathing became more erratic and his vital signs more unstable, an interesting dynamic began to emerge. The various family members and staff naturally organized themselves into a hierarchy of emotional importance, with those closest to Charles taking positions nearest to his bed. Camilla remained at his right side, holding his hand and continuing her gentle conversation about gardens and grandchildren and all the things he had loved in life. William positioned himself at his father's left side, his own hand resting on Charles's shoulder in a gesture of both comfort and farewell. And Catherine found herself directly behind Camilla, close enough to offer support, but not so close as to intrude on the most intimate moments of goodbye. The crisis came suddenly, and without warning. Charles's breathing, which had been irregular for the past hour, suddenly stopped completely. The monitors erupted in alarms, and Dr. Henley moved quickly to assess his condition. His heart rate is dropping rapidly, she announced, her professional composure intact despite the emotional weight of the moment. The next few seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. Everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing the end of a reign, the conclusion of a life, the moment when Britain would need to begin the process of adapting to a new monarch and a new era. It was then that Charles's eyes suddenly opened. The surprise was so complete that several people actually stepped backward. After hours of unconsciousness, after medical predictions of imminent death, Charles was suddenly awake and aware, looking around the room with confusion but unmistakable consciousness. His gaze moved from face to face, taking in the assembled family members and the worried expressions of the medical staff. When his eyes reached Camilla, he attempted to speak, but his voice was too weak to carry. Camilla leaned closer, bringing her ear near his mouth to catch whatever words he was trying to say. Everyone in the room held their breath, waiting to hear what might be Charles's final message. But instead of speaking to his wife of nearly 2 decades, Charles did something that surprised everyone present. His eyes moved past Camilla, searching the room until they found Catherine standing just behind her. With tremendous effort, he lifted his arm slightly and reached toward the Princess of Wales. The gesture was unmistakable. Charles was reaching for Catherine, not Camilla. The silence in the room was so complete that the only sounds were the beeping of medical equipment and the soft rustle of movement as people processed what they were witnessing. Catherine looked from Charles's outstretched hand to Camilla's shocked face, unsure how to respond to such an unprecedented moment. Royal protocol had no provisions for this situation, a dying king reaching for his daughter-in-law instead of his wife. But Camilla, to her eternal credit, made the decision for all of them. Without hesitation, she moved slightly aside and gently guided Catherine forward to take her place beside Charles's bed. "He wants you," Camilla said simply, her voice thick with emotion but free of any trace of resentment or jealousy. Catherine knelt beside the bed and took Charles's hand, feeling the weakness in his grip, but also sensing the urgency behind his gesture. When she was close enough, Charles managed to speak, his voice barely audible but clearly directed at her. "Take care of them," he whispered, and Catherine understood that he wasn't just talking about the family or the monarchy, but about something larger, the people, the institution, the future that would continue after he was gone. "I promise," Catherine whispered back, and she saw something like peace cross Charles's features. He squeezed her hand once, weakly but deliberately, and then his eyes closed again. Within moments, his breathing steadied, his vital signs improved, and Dr. Henley was announcing with amazement that his condition seemed to be stabilizing. The crisis had passed, at least for now, but the moment of Charles reaching for Catherine instead of Camilla had changed something fundamental in the room. It wasn't that he loved Catherine more than his wife. That was clearly not the case. But in his moment of extremis, his thoughts had turned to the future, to the young woman who would one day be queen, and who would carry forward everything he had worked to build. The gesture revealed the depth of trust Charles had developed in Catherine, his confidence in her ability to guide the monarchy through the challenges ahead. But, more than that, it demonstrated the authentic love that had grown between them, not the formal affection of royal duty, but the genuine care that develops between people who have shared real experiences and emotions. As Charles drifted back into peaceful sleep, this time with more stable vital signs, the assembled family members slowly began to process what they had witnessed. The moment would be talked about for years to come, analyzed by historians and biographers and royal watchers trying to understand the dynamics within the House of Windsor. But for those who were present in that hospital room, the meaning was crystal clear. In his moment of greatest vulnerability, Charles had revealed the true depth of his feelings for Catherine and his absolute confidence in her future role. He had publicly acknowledged, in the most powerful way possible, that she was not just William's wife or a dutiful daughter-in-law, but someone he trusted completely with the future of everything he held dear. Camilla, rather than being hurt by her husband's gesture, seemed to understand its significance better than anyone. As the family gradually dispersed to make phone calls and handle the practical arrangements that the day's crisis had necessitated, she pulled Catherine aside for a private conversation. "He sees something in you," Camilla said quietly. "Something special that goes beyond your role as William's wife or even as a future queen. You've given him peace about what happens next, and that's a gift that I could never provide." Catherine felt overwhelmed by the generosity and wisdom in Camilla's words. "I never intended," she began, but Camilla stopped her. "I know you didn't," Camilla said. "That's exactly why it matters so much. Your love for him, for all of us, is completely authentic. And in a world where so much is calculated and managed and performed, authenticity is the rarest and most precious gift of all." Charles survived that day, and several more weeks beyond it. But the moment when he reached for Catherine instead of Camilla became a defining memory for everyone who witnessed it. Proof that even in a monarchy built on tradition and protocol, the most important bonds are still the ones forged by genuine human connection and love. The room had indeed gone silent, but not from scandal or impropriety. It had gone silent from recognition of a moment of pure truth, of love expressed without calculation, of trust freely given and gratefully received. It was a moment that revealed the best of what the royal family could be when stripped of pretense and ceremony. Simply people who cared deeply for each other and who would do whatever was necessary to protect and support those they loved.